Hi, I wanted to go over Greg's example from class. This is the one about the two treatment groups and the control. I thought maybe it would be helpful to sort of see what that looks like in the data form and in STATA. And I think usually sort of looking at things in multiple ways helps sort of build intuition. So let me quickly share my screen. This is just a quick summary. We saw that in those three bar graphs, the treatment group had a mean of 110, or treatment group 1. Treatment group 2 had a mean of 105, and the control group had a mean of 100. I'll just refer to these as T1, T2, and C. So if we have a categorical variable that says you're in T1, T2, or C, we would use this categorical variable, sort of like what we did with SES, and create a dummy variable for each of those group indicators. So if you're in T1, you get a 1 for T1 and a 0 for the rest. If you're in T2, you get a 1 for T2 and a 0 for the rest. If you're in the control group, likewise, 1 for C and 0 for the rest. So in terms of the data, what does the data look like? You might have these variables, person ID, here's the group variable, T1, T2, C, test score. So here's an example of person 1. They're in treatment group 1, so they get a 1 for T1, 0 for T2, 0 for C, and they have a test score of 101. I just sort of made these up so that it gives us the mean value that we saw before. So these are the 3 people in T1. Mean of 110. You can see that this is going to have a mean of 105. This is going to have a mean of 100. So let's put this into STATA and see what that looks like in its regression form. Okay, so I just opened up STATA. I'm going to open up a data editor. It's basically the same as the data browser, except it allows you to put stuff in. So I'm going to copy this data set here, put it into STATA, and I'll say that this very first row is the variable name and is not the values of the data. Okay, and we can do some basic tests now, right? We see our variables in here. Maybe by group, we can summarize test score. Sort. If you're in treatment group, 100, control group 100, T1 110, T2 105, stuff we've seen. And the equation that you guys figured out and we saw in class was that y is going to equal a plus b1 times T1 plus b2 times T2. The variables that we have here are y, which is test score, T1, and T2. So I'm going to regress y, test score, on T1 and T2. Notice that the control group is left out. Let me make this a little bit bigger. We didn't do this, and I'll explain why. The regression is going to give you sort of mean differences between groups. It's always trying to compare things, especially when you're using dichotomous variables. And as we saw in class, T1, right, is this variable here. Oh, sorry. 10, the coefficient on T1 is going to be B1. And the coefficient for T2, which is B2, is going to be 5. So this equation now reads 1 equals A plus B1, which is 10, times T1 plus 5 times T2. And we can also plug in the A, which is the constant. And so what T1 here is telling you is the difference between T1 and the group that does not appear here, which is the treatment group. And what T2 tells you is the difference between T2 and the group that's not appearing here, which is the control group. that's the reference group or the omitted group. These all mean the same thing. And because in this equation, the control group is going to become, if you plug in that, if you're in the control group, for T1, you got a 0. T2, you got a 0. For C, you got a 1. So here, if you plug this in, you're going to get that y is equal to a plus b1 times 0 plus b2 times 0. And that ends up with y equals a, which is 100, which is the mean value of the control group. So the other, and so you were asked 3 questions. Compare the control group to T1, control group to T2, and then T1 to T2. So an easy way to compare them is to make one of them the reference group, meaning make one of them the omitted group. Just basically means take them out of the regression line. So you can regress test score on T1 and control. And so the group that I've left out is T2. And what I can tell is now this T1 tells me what the value is when you compare the means of T1 and T2. And this control group tells me what's the difference between the mean of the control group and T2. But to answer this third question, how do the treatment groups differ? I would be reading this line. And we got to this other question. Sorry, before we get to that other question, like Greg kept saying, one way to do this is to throw out a group. So if you wanted to regress treatment group 1 and compare them to the control group, you regress the outcome test score on treatment group 1. And this is now comparing the treatment group to the omitted group. Except in this case, people who are omitted, they belong in 2 groups. They're in the control group and in the second treatment group. So people who get a 1 here for T1, they're these 3 people. Right? People who get a 0 here, and this is why they don't show up in the regression, there are 2 groups of people. People in T2 and people in C. And what the 7.5 is doing is it is comparing this treatment group 1 to these 2 groups. And that's not what you want, because you don't really care about how one group does compared to 2 other groups. And so one thing you can do is you could basically delete them. And the equivalent of doing that in STATA is you drop if C is equal to 1. Now if I tap group, I only have the 2 treatment groups. So if I regress test score on T1, it is just going to compare T1 to the omitted group, which is just T2. Right? These are the 3 people with 1s compared to the 2 people with 0s. And you can do this again and again, where you only have in your data people with T1, the T1 group and the C group, or the T2 group with the C group, or whatever. And just this regression of regressing test score on T1 will give you that direct comparison. You don't have to worry about your reference group being two groups. I hope this kind of helps, but let me know if it still doesn't make sense.